Hello, subscribers and eavesdroppers. Today, I'm really thrilled to be speaking to Batya Ungar-Sargon, direct from New York City, where it's 5 o'clock yesterday, her time, the following morning in Melbourne, my time. Batya is a widely published journalist and author. She's written 2 books. Her first one, released in 2021, is titled Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. And ain't that true? And I should say that Batya is an opinion editor at Newsweek, which as a publication is probably a bit less woke than most. And her current book, which is extremely timely, is called Second Class: How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. And as you can imagine, Batya these days is hot property. She is all over the media. She's on Fox News. She's on Bill Maher. So I'm pretty thrilled to have her here with me speaking. She is a independent thinker, if ever there was one, and a very challenging one. And I'm sure she'll be challenging me today. If nothing else, Batya, you'll be challenging me to get a Star of David necklace that is as loud and conspicuous as yours. Mine doesn't quite measure up.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here with you, Julie. I'm so glad that you reached out and I'm excited for this conversation.
And I am too. Batya, let's start with your incredible book, Second Class. It is such a rich read. Uh, the research is incredible, the case studies that you bring to life. And as I understand it, that book it was a natural progression from your first book about the woke media. Can you tell us why that was?
Yeah, so the argument I made in my first book was that the reason that our media is so terrible is not actually because it is left, although of course it's very liberal. It's because it is produced almost exclusively by the elites, by people who have been to very fancy universities, who make quite a bit more money than the average American, who live in fancy neighborhoods in coastal cities. And this kind of elite journalistic caste had abandoned the working class that journalists used to belong to in order to cater to the concerns of their neighbors, other over-credentialed college elites, and that a lot of the woke language, in fact, all of the woke language around race and gender was simply an alibi for their abandonment of the working class, a way to cast themselves as the good guys in a morality play, while they were actually the primary beneficiaries of a huge upward transfer of wealth in American society. And as I was writing this book about our dissolute elites, I was trying to kind of explain to people how alien the culture that so much of our journalism is produced under the auspices of is to average people, normies, we call them now, middle class and working class Americans. And one of the real primary distinctions there is that people in these sort of over-credentialed elites really believe in and trust a kind of paternalistic outlook. They have a lot of trust in institutions, of course, because institutions have done very well for them, right?
Mm.
And so they really believe in sort of big government. They believe in, the sanctity of fancy institutions because, of course, they got a lot of their status in society out of that. And meanwhile, working class people, they're very alienated by a paternalistic outlook. In fact, they really value autonomy and freedom and self-reliance and hard work, the labor of their hands. And I kept sort of struggling to articulate this to people in my cast to explain why their journalism falls so much on deaf ears, why it's coming from a place that is just like totally alien to normal people. And I kept reaching for a book to be like, here, read this. You'll understand what journalists used to be like. You'll understand what the working class is like why people like this just it's just meaningless to them when they see, people that you think are great go out there with these slogans. And I couldn't really find a book that satisfied me, that really articulated this class divide, both from a cultural and economic point of view. What there was a lot of ethnographies of the working class, not a lot, but a fair number, written by very left-wing sociologists. Sociology is one of the most captured by the left, disciplines, I'll do it like that, in America. And so these liberal and left-wing, very well-meaning, liberal and left-wing academics would sort of go, on safari into the working class, and they would interview working class people about what they wanted and what their lives were like. And the working class people would invariably tell them, like, we hate welfare, we hate welfare, we know people are scamming the system, we hate welfare. And invariably, the conclusions in these books on how to assist the struggling working class would be like, do you know what they really need is more welfare? And when I got to the end of like the third or fourth such ethnography, I thought to myself, okay, there's a journalistic book here to be written. I keep reaching for a book. It doesn't really exist in the way I would want it to. I'll write that book.
How interesting. And I think it's highly amusing that you refer to yourself as a member of a caste, but we are. You're right. So you did something extremely old-fashioned these days. You traveled around America for about a year, interviewing the American working class, which is a big group, isn't it? It ranges from people at the very edge of poverty and nearly falling into the abyss and just trying to hang on by their fingernails, to people who are doing very well, thanks largely to the union movement. But I got the sense in your book that you were genuinely surprised by some of what you encountered. Is that right? And what would you say was the biggest revelation for you?
First of all, how many people are actually solidly middle class who are working class? I use middle class to refer to a standard of living, home ownership, access to healthcare, retirement, and children who are upwardly mobile. The American dream in short. And there were a lot of people, not the majority by any means, but a sizable portion. That surprised me a lot. The consensus on the issues surprised me enormously, that, just the absolute unity when it came to policy. And this from people who vote from different parties, because each party does such a bad job of representing the working class that it's kind of a crapshoot. You can kind of vote on immigration or healthcare, you can vote on gay marriage or transgender issues, right? You could vote on welfare, right? Or on, the American dream, right? There's no party that is actually representing where working class people are on all of those issues, which is sort of right dead center. So for example, the vast majority of working class people, whether they vote for Republicans or Democrats, are extremely pro-gay and extremely unhappy about trans. So there's no LGBT in the working class. There's a lot of Christians who have a gay person in their life who they want treated with love and respect, and who they hope will get married and find love, someone of the same sex. And there's a lot of Democrats who are very upset about Drag Queen Story Hour, very upset about trans people on women's sports teams, in women's bathrooms, and very upset that people are talking about sex to their kids. So who should they vote for, right? There's total consensus there between Republican and Democratic working class people. But you have one party that's like the party of Drag Queen Story Hour, and the other party that until Donald Trump was against gay marriage, right? Same thing about, an issue like immigration and healthcare. The vast majority of Democrats I interviewed, and this tracks with the polling, want much less immigration. And the majority of the Republicans I spoke to want some sort of government-backed access to healthcare, catastrophic healthcare, right? So who should they vote for? There's one party that talks about healthcare but believes in an open border, and another party that believes in policing the border but will never talk about healthcare, right? So some people pick one issue, some people pick the other, but they know that the person standing next to them in the line, even though they vote for the other party, probably agrees with them on most issues. So that I found very surprising.
And when we speak about, I suppose we should say, about the working class these days, we're not necessarily speaking about an income designation, are we? The dividing line is education.
Yes, absolutely. So the way that I define working class in the book, after sort of speaking to a lot of academics and reading a lot of the literature, the definition that made the most sense to me was people who work in a job that doesn't require skills you would have picked up in college. So even though some of them have a degree, but they're not using that degree for their job, who've been locked out of the top 20%. I mean, I'm sure we all know very wealthy contractors, you know, I'm not talking about them, you know, and also there are people with college degrees who work in the service industry, and I would consider them also working class, although a lot of people take 2 years off between college and grad school to work at Starbucks that, you know, sure, right now they count, but they know that their fortunes will increase as they, you know, continue down the educational line. And so, yeah, it's definitely education, I think, is a much bigger predictor for whether you will have access to the American dream, you know, than income.
And we're talking about 2/3 of Americans who are members of this class. I thought some of the most revealing aspects of your book was about immigration and about the views of the working class about immigration. Tell us in a nutshell, what is it that people like me, people of my caste, educated and left-leaning and very well-intentioned, what is it that we don't get about immigration?
So the class divide on immigration was one of the first things that I noticed even before I started writing this book. For college educated elites, we tend to think of immigration in moral terms. We see these desperate people and our heart goes out to them and we think, well, we have more than enough. Why can't we share with them? And their suffering is so unimaginable to us, like that they would leave everything to do something so dangerous in which the women are probably going to get raped in order to come here and pursue the American dream. Would we really, you know, such a horrible situation? We fill that gap between us and them with immense amounts of pity. And then, you know, create policy to ameliorate those feelings. And the problem with that is twofold. The first is that while I think a lot of people genuinely have those feelings of empathy, they are also benefiting in very real economic terms from that mass immigration. They consume the labor of these migrants as opposed to consuming the labor of native-born Americans or Australians, and as a result pay much less for services that would have cost them much more 30, 40, 50 years ago. I mean, 50 years ago, you could be a manicurist and buy a home, right? Now, today, that's obviously impossible because the women who give other women manicures are from, you know, China and Vietnam and very poor countries where you can get a manicure for 20 bucks, right? Obviously, the woman giving you that service cannot buy a home on that. And so, you know, there is a lot of empathy there. But the truth is that it is very much in the economic interests of the elites to have those open border policies. And meanwhile, on the other side of things, working class Americans, it's not that they don't have empathy for immigrants, for illegal immigrants. They have a lot of empathy for them because they could very easily picture themselves having to do that. They are also pretty broke. And because there's no gap there, they don't understand why so much is being done for these people and nothing being done for them. It's very hard for them to understand it because they're not sitting pretty feeling like this country has enormous bounty to share with anybody. They are really struggling and they can't for the life of them understand why the elites have so much pity for those people and nothing for them. And meanwhile, of course, those wages that would have been paid to them are getting paid to illegal immigrants. The economists as a class will tell you that immigration raises the GDP overall. Now, of course, they are right. Mass immigration does raise the GDP overall. The problem is that GDP is not evenly distributed, right? We don't hand out GDP based on the number of people, take the aggregate and divide it because we believe in capitalism. And all of the gains of the GDP as a result of mass immigration have gone to the top 20% to our caste. And it was literal wage theft of our working class neighbors. And so, you know, in other words, we have these real emotions of pity, but they are masking a very real economic reality in which these liberal, well-meaning leftist elites have effectively waged class warfare on their own neighbors and used this rhetoric of sympathy and asylum seeking and refugees and pity to mask that.
think there's a very powerful bit in your book where you speak to somebody who says that, they don't see a lot of difference between them and the immigrant. And they say, but the difference is one of citizenship. I'm an American citizen, and that ought to count for something. And I thought that was a very telling remark.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, explain this to me, which is something I don't quite understand from this distance. I must say that over the past few years, at some point, I took my eye off the United States. It was not as interesting as it once was. I thought things were ticking along well enough. If you had said to me 4 years ago that we're now going to be looking at the very real prospect of a second Trump administration, I would have thought you were crazy. So tell me, what has happened as you're a very close observer of the American political scene? What has happened in the intervening period? Is it all about Joe Biden's cognitive decline, or is there something else going on here?
Well, so there's what was happening over the last 4 years, and then what was happening over the last 4 weeks, which really accelerated things in a very dramatic fashion. So now I'm trying to go back beyond that because there's so much happening right now. It's like, and it's happening so fast. The country was not in a good state. I think for most Americans, according to polls, the primary concerns were immigration, inflation, jobs, the economy, and safe streets for their kids. And on all of those issues, it's not just Joe Biden, it's the Democratic Party. We're just getting failing marks. Immigration is the number one issue right now for Americans. And the Democrats' answer to that has been, well, you're racist, And it just doesn't work anymore. We've gotten sort of past the moral panic around race. And I think most Americans now feel like I don't want to be called racist for wanting to be able to feed my children. And increasingly, Black and Hispanic voters, especially men, especially working class, have been trending to the right toward Trump because they just can't afford anything. And, as that has become more of a reality, the debate dropped into the laps of, an American electorate that was already feeling kind of gaslit because they knew the economy was terrible, but they would turn on their TV and see administration officials talking about Bidenomics and how great things are. They felt really gaslit. And then suddenly they see this man on screen and they're like, this is our president. And realize that the media and the Democratic elites and the administration and everyone close to the president had been lying for the last who knows how many years. I mean, if you watched Fox News, if you watched Daily Wire, or if you got your media from any conservative outlet, you knew the truth. And I think a lot of people feel like they have egg on their face. Like, why did their conservative friends who were saying that he's kind of declining mentally, they were right. And that crisis in trust for the media, I think the minute you're like, oh, they lied about something so big, it makes you start thinking like, okay, well, what else did they maybe lie about? Maybe they lied about Trump being racist. Maybe they lied about Trump being this or that. And I think a lot of people are taking another look now, especially then after the assassination attempt, where it was like, who is this person? Like, and people are really, they're longing for the feeling that things were better and headed in the right direction. And I think ironically, people are starting to think, we were actually better off under Trump, but we had this feeling that everything was terrible. And maybe the media manufactured those feelings, but wages were up for working class people for the first time in 50 years. Trump actually shrank the wealth gap, the first American president to do that in 50 years. Now, if you're a rich elite, that doesn't mean a lot to you. But if you make $50,000 a year, that means a lot to you. And, that things were actually much more stable then, but the media was unhappy, whereas now things are terrible, but the media is very happy because it's a Democrat. I think for a lot of people, that's not sitting right.
I imagine there'd be many commentators and economists who would perhaps contest the reasons for why economic conditions were the way they were under Trump and why workers might have been better off. But I'm taken by Trump's decision to announce J.D. Vance, of course, as his running mate. He is the self-made man, but also very much has fashioned himself as a kind of working class, an advocate for the working class. And you've written a piece where you have said that this signals really a new direction in the Republican Party, that this is the end of the Republican Party, of the Chamber of Commerce, and of the Country Club, and so on. But in your book, you do make very clear, as you have said before, that the working class in America really does not have a party that represents them entirely. And isn't that really still the case? I mean, the Republican Party, even in its new iteration, won't ever introduce universal healthcare. They won't tax the rich. They won't tax corporations. Isn't it still the party of the Country Club and the Chamber of Commerce?
I don't think it is. I think that Trump's accomplishments in the first term, starting a trade war with China, putting tariffs on steel and aluminum, policing the border, destroying NAFTA, signing the most pro-labor trade deal in American history into law, these things had an immediate and radical impact on the working class. You wouldn't see the head of the Teamsters Union, Sean O'Brien, speaking at the RNC if he has a very close relationship with Trump. And Sean O'Brien is an American hero. That man will do anything to get better conditions, working conditions for his Teamsters. I mean, that's really proof positive right there. All of the old school Republicans are furious that Trump picked J.D. Vance. They don't want to see him on the ticket. The entire Republican donor class backed Nikki Haley. She outspent Donald Trump 2-1 in the Republican primary, 2-1. I mean, American democracy is alive and kicking. If you can take on somebody who has twice as much money as you and still blow them out of the water with the sheer force of your policy, the GOP now is the anti-war party. It is the pro-worker party. It is socially moderate. So Trump took all of the anti-gay marriage, pro-life language out of the GOP agenda. I mean, talk about a coup. He manhandled that whole process, and the elites are furious, and he just could not care less. He's not there to talk to the elites. He's there to talk to the voters. You look at how he's sort of, basically like, can't stand Project 2025 and is making no bones about it. He's, talking smack about that every chance he gets because he says that is an extremist agenda and I am down the middle. I am for the working man. So I really think that they have a very pro-worker agenda right now. And I have heard from campaign officials and party officials that they have every intention of coming up with a healthcare plan. Now, maybe they will and maybe they won't. But if you're looking at the two parties side by side, the Democrats' agenda is catered to the over-credentialed college elites, the top 25%, and the dependent poor. So they have this uneasy coalition where they cater to people who are the dependent poor and then the rich. And that left the entire kind of middle of the country. And if you look at Trump's agenda, this is a 90s era Democrat agenda. It's pro-union. He's courting Black voters, 15 weeks on abortion. That used to be the Democrats' position. Pro-tariffs, control the border to protect working class wages. That was the Democrats' position in the 1990s. So this is really a consensus platform. It's just that people don't realize that because the media has worked so hard to cast him as an extremist.
Is it entirely a 1990s democratic platform on foreign policy? I find it hard to get my head around how abandoning Ukraine and appeasing Vladimir Putin is in America's strategic interests.
He wants to end the war, and I think he'll that you could call that appeasement, but being anti-war used to be the Democrats' position, and now that's the Republicans' position. He wants the war to be over, and I think that he and Putin had a great relationship. There's Putin wants to end the war. I mean, he's obviously running out of willpower, and I mean he's been trying to end the war since he started it. So I think there's a really good chance that Trump could make good on that, but being anti-war means wanting to end wars, right? And that's what he wants to do there.
Yeah. Um, I At the end of your book, you also say that it is necessary that the working class find that the representatives stand up who are serious about advancing America's working class. You say that that is absolutely essential for the sanctity of American democracy, which it is undoubtedly. I guess again, this brings me to another question, a kind of question that I'm wrestling with about Trump. Isn't kind of 101 of American democracy accepting the results of a democratic election and the peaceful transfer of power? And he broke that
Um,
essential compact with the American people.
Aside from the riot that happened in the Capitol, he did not go far and beyond other American presidents or presidential candidates who contested an election. We've had many people say, I want to recount here, I want to recount there, invoke the Supreme Court. Is that what I would have done? Would I have taken it as far as he did? I wouldn't have. But I think that, wanting to pursue every legal avenue you have open to you, I think that is consistent with, you know, the democratic process. He left. I mean, he left peacefully, left the White House. There was a horrible riot. Things got out of hand. It was political violence. It was devastating, and 800, miscreants are in prison. And I think that's a good thing. That's where they belong. Could he have been more forceful in his language on that day? He could have been. I, I don't think that he sort of covered himself in glory on that day, but he did leave. He pursued every legal avenue he had open to him in an election that he thought was not fair, and in which, some irregularities certainly have come out since then. Not enough, again, according to me, to justify the path that he pursued. But the idea that he's a threat to democracy, I think, I don't think that that view has a lot of merit.
He's still contesting the results of that election. He's
Which
still
is the
saying
only reason
it
he's
was
not in prison,
stolen.
right? Because there was a lawsuit against him claiming fraud, right? He still believes that he won. He believes that the irregularities were such that he actually won the election. I don't believe that, but that means that he vacated the White House and did a peaceful transfer of power, believing that he lost. And that's a pretty magnanimous thing to do, I have to say.
Um, Batya, I'm interested in your immediate response the to Kamala Harris's almost certain clinching of the Democratic nomination, and how you think that that's going to play out, and how you think Americans are going to respond to her.
I think she's probably the weakest Democrat to replace Biden with, but she is the most Democratic one to replace him with because she was already on the ticket. And so, having enacted this soft coup against Biden, at least the person they're replacing him with is somebody who voters also sort of voted for. I do think that there was sort of a soft coup here, and very gross behavior by democratic elites and donors and actors and former presidents to sort of grab a big hook and drag Joe Biden off the stage in a way that made me feel really sorry for him. And these are the very people who knew the situation and kept it from the American people, so I think that's pretty gross. It's sort of a mixed bag because she's probably, the idea that she can beat Trump, I think, is kind of laughable. But on the other hand, there's a part of me that's relieved that it was her, because at least it's somebody that the primary voters voted for, sort of.
Yes, it's pretty galling when you have kind of George Clooney
Yeah,
throwing his weight around and
yeah,
deciding who's going to be president.
exactly.
Certainly. Batya, I know that your time is short, and I'm terribly grateful that were able to speak to me today. I'd love to have you back at some other point. There is so much more to talk
Absolutely.
about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Julie. Seriously, God bless you, and get that mug in David.
I will upgrade, most definitely. Thank you, Batya. and
Sure.
be well.
Okay, you too. Thank you so much.